Hello, today we're going to talk about logical fallacies and propaganda techniques. Both of these subjects are introduced in Unit 4 of our textbook. You may recall that Unit 4 is about reading and analyzing arguments. Logical fallacies and propaganda are errors in arguments. Before we start, let's discuss why these concepts are important beyond this class. When you read or watch news or opinion pieces on television, social media, or elsewhere, you'll be bombarded with authors promoting their point of view. They may have political agendas, personal agendas, or even be attempting to persuade you to buy something. As you evaluate this type of information and consider what your own point of view should be, an educated, critical thinker will examine the validity and quality of the evidence the author provides when determining if their argument is valid and sound. A critical thinker will also be able to recognize problems with an argument and persuasive techniques that attempt to manipulate the audience. And that's what logical fallacies and propaganda techniques are: problems or errors in an argument and techniques that attempt to persuade the audience in a manipulative manner. Let's take a closer look at definitions of these two terms. What is a logical fallacy? A fallacy is an error of reasoning. These are flawed statements, but they often sound true. They are mistakes or problems with the author's argument. Logical fallacies are often used to strengthen an argument, but if the reader detects them, then that reason that's given may make that argument backfire and damage the writer's credibility. It's also true that logical fallacies are generally unintentional. When forming the argument, the author is unaware their logic is fallacious, either because they've not studied logic or they've not recognized an error in their own thinking. What is propaganda? Propaganda is a deliberate error, so it happened on purpose. And it's designed to convince or even manipulate the audience. In other words, the author is purposefully misleading the audience for their own gain. It may be to get people to behave in a way that the author wants, or it may even be to convince someone to buy something they are selling. Now, propaganda itself is not inherently bad, as behaving in a certain way may actually benefit you or society, or the product being sold might be a good product. However, propaganda is inherently manipulative. In other words, it's attempting to control the audience. It's designed to persuade an audience without providing a sound argument. Now, a little close-up or a little deeper examination of the difference between propaganda and logical fallacy. Whereas logical fallacy is an error in logic, often unintentional, for one specific argumentative piece presented by an individual author. Propaganda is a technique purposefully used on a larger scale, and rather than being a single individual and a single argument, it's used by an institution, a business, or even the government. Now, in order to clarify what logical fallacy and propaganda are, in order to make it easier for you as a critical reader or a critical thinker to spot errors, we're going to take a look at some specific types and examples of logical fallacy and propaganda. But before we do that, I want to talk again about why this is important. You might already be starting to see why you might need to understand these concepts in real life. Just like we learned earlier about lateral reading and how it helps you evaluate information you read online, understanding argumentation and logic are important real-life skills that we can use on a daily basis as well. You know, as Americans, we often take our freedom to make our own decisions for granted. That's not always historically been true, that we're allowed to make our own decisions, nor is it true everywhere in the world today. Back in the medieval times, the Middle Ages in the Western world, think kings and queens and knights and lords and ladies, it was believed that the average person did not have the intellectual ability, the intelligence, to make decisions on big issues. They were thought to not be smart enough to make moral, ethical, and societal decisions. The nobles and the priests made those decisions for the people, and they largely believed that that was their God-given right and duty. Fortunately, along came the Renaissance, a period in time where it was once again believed that every single person has the ability to reason and think logically and make important moral, ethical, and political decisions. And when our country separated from England, we wanted a government founded on the idea that the regular man can think logically and make decisions for himself and his society, that all men should have an equal say. Well, it's taken a while to bring not only men but minorities and women to the table, but this idea that all people have the right to make moral, ethical, and political decisions for the country still persists. It is through argumentation that we, as Americans, discuss important issues and make important decisions. Whether that is to enact a certain law, which we might vote for, or if we're a member of a jury, we might be presented arguments by two different lawyers on different sides and be asked to make a decision about who has the best argument in order to decide if the person is guilty or not guilty of a crime. We as Americans can look at issues and make decisions, or even choose not to be involved, and it's an amazing privilege we have. Our government has a lot of problems, but we still have the potential to make positive changes and have our voices count. Okay, enough of that. Let's go on to our 13 categories. Now, as we go through the categories, I haven't separated out which are logical fallacies and which are propaganda. That's because sometimes it's obvious, but also because there's a lot of crossover between the two. A specific example could be both logical fallacy and propaganda. a specific category might be either. And it's not as important to be able to say whether something is logical fallacy or propaganda as it is to be able to recognize that there is a problem that makes the argument invalid or even manipulative. Ready to look at those 13 types? We're going to take a look at some of them that are presented in your textbook, but we're going to look at more types and look at them a little bit more in depth. Let's start with the bandwagon approach. The bandwagon approach is the argument that the majority must be right. In other words, if most people are doing something, voting for something, thinking something, buying something, then it must be good or it must be right. Now, this is not true. Just because most people buy it or do it, it doesn't mean that the majority isn't wrong. So, bandwagon statements are fallacious. For example, if a friend says, hey, it must be cool because everyone is doing it, let's do it. That's a logical fallacy. Just because everyone is doing it doesn't make it okay. Another example of the bandwagon approach is if you see an advertisement that says 90% of computer users choose Macs. Well, I don't think that's true, but even if it were true, we would need data supporting that. But if that's just an advertisement trying to get you to buy a Mac, remember, just because everyone is doing it doesn't mean you should too. And this particular logical fallacy is also sometimes called the appeal to popularity. So why bandwagon? What is a bandwagon? Well, back in the frontier days, before there was television, telephones, certainly before computers, people who had an issue to present, it might be a political agenda, a moral agenda, they would go to the main street of a town and they would hire a horse and wagon. And in the wagon they would put a band, and the band would play popular music. And that would attract people to come and listen to the speech. And sometimes people would get so influenced and persuaded and so excited that they would jump on the bandwagon, or they would follow the bandwagon through the streets. Just remember that just because the majority believes something, thinks something, or do something, that is not a good argument for doing it. Let's go to our second type of logical fallacy, which is slippery slope. This is a fallacious argument built on the supposition that a small step will lead to a larger chain of events. Imagine yourself at the top of a ski slope. You start going down slowly, and as you progress, you go faster and faster until you get to the very bottom. Well, if an argument says you take one step in a specific direction, and that will inevitably lead you to catastrophe, then that is the slippery slope argument. We're going to take a quick pause here, and when we continue with part 2 of this video, we'll finish talking about the slippery slope logical fallacy, and we'll look at the remaining types or categories of logical fallacy and propaganda. I'll see you for part 2.